I don't even know what that is. It goes in the turn sounds. I said, you know, it's my fault. It all looks like small. It's a version of steps. Regardless.
So then we designed.
Well, something
No, this is far as blocking, but I have a good side.
The roll call. Y'all have. It's like. City side. Well, I feel like I'm lost now. Always good. Everyone else good.
I'd rather tell you 5.5, especially when they got the. So
I did already complete. Well, I just feel it's a lot.
Well, yeah, it's done. Well, it's been fun. We got some.
You're fat.
Laptop.
it was fun.
Yeah.
The academy lost
Hey. You got a forum? Does they form? Out of one team?
Nine.
Nine is gonna be a forum, right?
Yep. No, at least it's not a response. Like, but I think.
So I see Sarah Lee's in the online lobby. Well, we can get a lot of cops today. Got the motion ready, John? Sorry.
Yeah.
Actually, believe you're to come to a consensus. Fine. I know, but thinking a lot about where.
I'm thinking nine. Better. But yeah. It's 1:00. I'm calling the April 2nd, 2025 meeting of ENRAC order at this time. Could you please call the roll? And Mr. Urban has walked in and I need to welcome
Okay, roll call. Ms. Lammers,
here.
Ms. Gow, Ms. Anderson, Ms. Brosmer,
Here.
Mr. Burbank,
Here.
Mr. Fitzsimmons, Mr. Hobblick,
Here.
Ms. Jamison.
I'm here.
All right, Mr. Geronimo.
Here.
Mr. Lights,
Here.
Mr. Malmberg,
Here.
Ms. Morrissey. She is on here. Okay, so we'll have to vote to allow her to participate when we're done here. Mr. Surratt
Here.
and Ms. Whittick. Okay, so we have a quorum. Fine. We have a quorum, and if you'd like to allow Ms. Morrissey to participate online, we'll have to have a.
I'll move.
Second.
Motion was made by Tom Burbank, seconded by Tyler Melberg, sorry, I went to Sweden, too many noir TV shows, to allow Sarah Lee Morrissey to participate remotely in today's meeting. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Sarah Lee, you get to be with us. Thank you.
I think Ms. Anderson just joined us online as well. So
Can we confirm that?
Wendy, are you here?
Yes, I am here.
Okay, so we'll have to vote for her.
Okay, we'll entertain a motion.
I'll move.
Moved by Tom Burbank, seconded by John Hobblick to allow Wendy Anderson to participate remotely in today's meeting. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Wendy, you may participate. Okay. We will entertain motions or comments to the minutes from the March 5th meeting. Am I allowed to make comments? Of course. I'm not going to be as good as Sarah Lee. Sorry to disappoint. I think we're missing a verb or something. Roll call was taken. This is line 9, page 1. Roll call was taken with member John Hobblick, full stop.
Appreciate that.
And I think the word absent might be what was there, so that's one. On page 2, I don't know if I'm happy with the phrasing of it. And I rephrased lines 14 through 16 because I'm not sure what they say is what I thought I said, which was Chair Lammer stated that during our early 2022 meetings, our orientation really, we were advised to review Chapter 72 prior to Chapter 50 because Chapter 50 changes would have to be approved by the municipalities, and because in general we were to update ordinances. And I'm belaboring that point a little because at least that's what I had always understood.
So we can go back and look at the audio if you want and just make
Okay.
whatever tweaks.
In line 2627, I'm just wondering if we need to clarify for the future. I realize minutes have to be more like a closed captioning than what was actionable, but Ms. Adair clarified that the council adopted the changes the committee recommended to the stormwater ordinance. And I'm just wondering if we need, that's implicit Chapter 72. I guess everyone would understand that. So never mind. And then our agenda, we have old business none, but there are two kind of follow-up items that appear here on the minutes that maybe we can just kind of get a timeline on. One was from Ms. Swank, assistant. This is on page 536 through 38. Ms. Swank, Assistant County Attorney, agreed that the municipalities would need to include the Chapter 50 changes in their own ordinances to enforce it. She offered to investigate the matter further and bring back additional information. Future date, okay. Maybe next time. And on the 6th, does anyone know, Tad's not with us today, does anyone know the timing for the information for us to circle back to Miller Lake? I know it's not the big priority at this moment, but do we have an estimate of that at all? Okay.
I have not heard from
And
Tad.
finally, that's it, whole business, because we'll be discussing priorities. Clarendon.
Yes, ma'am. In regards to Miller Lake, there is been attorneys retained by the ownership of the property owner or by the property owners for Miller Lake. So we believe that we are facing a lawsuit. So at that point, any kind of discussion is going to be
It's pretty
held
cool.
until that's taken care of.
Understood. Thank you very much. And that's all I have. So I'm not allowed to make motions except like this.
So you won't have those.
Any seconds?
Seconds.
Motion made by John Pavlik, seconded by Jack Surratt to approve the minutes with the minor changes outlined. All those in favor? Any opposed? Thank you. And Ms. Gao has joined us. Thank you.
Yes, for the record, Ms. Gao joined us at 1:06. And if you would indulge me for a minute, I want to have a little discussion about minutes. We have a new, I don't know, program, fancy something, that AI to do the minutes. We're just testing it out. Minutes take a very long time. And so Chelsea spends, a bunch of hours doing minutes. And so the new AI program, the first time we tested it out, it was much less detailed than the minutes you've been used to getting. We can do it more like a direct transcript. And I just kind of wanted to have a little conversation here. We talked about minutes once before. I don't want to speak for the attorney's office, but the last time we talked about it, they're in favor of having something less detailed. I know sometimes for us, it's helpful to have it be more detailed. And so we're going to try to test it out maybe both ways. But the AI version was pretty good, saves a lot of time, but it was more like discussion ensued, motion was made,
Yeah.
here's the vote, right? So kind of want to know your thoughts as a group about how you want to continue to do the minutes.
That's the AI part that says discussion ensued.
Yeah, it's much more vague. Now, we can ask it to do like a very literal transcription. It just takes a lot more time and either way works. Just want to, and Madam Chair, if you would like to direct the who's talking where, that's.
I'm gonna jump ahead for a second and then recognize there. I was hoping you would recognize me, not as chair. I think the lawyers have to weigh in on what I would say. The two things that are most interesting, or most important to me when I go back to minutes are the actionable, the thinking and the actionable. There's a lot that we have to write in minutes that it takes time for us to get to the pith of something, and yet we write that into the minutes. So I'd love to hear that Jessica Gao said that the lizards have to be purple because that's what the federal laws dictate. And Mr. Havlick said, but we don't have purple lizards in Florida, so this is a moot point. And then what did we vote on and what's that? The next step to that. And I don't even know if that's possible or to be bolded and I do appreciate, and I thank Chelsea for doing all the minutes. I realize it's a Herculean task, and I'm also very glad to hear that you're piloting AI for it. That seems like a good use of AI. But I just wonder if they could be more useful to us, if it were more easy to find the thinking that let us land on a decision. That's my 2 cents. Mr. Surratt.
Yeah, I think less is more, and I think that's fine. Discussion ensued, and we go that route. We concentrate on the action items, and if there's relevant background that needs to be plugged in there, hopefully that will happen. But I think the minutes are too much, and we've got to wade through them each time, and I kind of lose track as I do that. So my opinion is that we're on the right track by reducing the amount of words.
Mr. Havlick, followed by Mr. Burbank, followed by Mr. Malberg.
I think I'm with Jack on less is good. The only thing I would suggest though, if you feel like your point that you're trying to make or what have you, you just need to state for the record so that it does make the minutes. And I think that helps clarify what we really want or intend to put into the minutes.
Thank you, John. Tom, Tyler, then Donna.
Thank you. I'm with that team, the less is more team also, and I've seen it both ways. AI will never replace handwritten minutes. They just can't do it because there are inflections, there are just things that we do, body language that it can't translate to. And I'll also notice that the minutes are not meant for us to look back on. The minutes are meant for posterity. For somebody to say, okay, they talked about this and they don't need all the detail. And unless it's quasi judicial, we don't need that much detail, which is the lawyer question. Thank you.
Tyler and Donna.
So I'm looking at this from I've been using a lot of AI tools the last 2 or 3 months, personally, professionally. And one of the things that I've found is that it will over reduce on the first path. If this is not a labor item, if it's literally just an AI tool, the computer's going to take some additional time. My thought would be have it produce a transcript and then have it produce a summary from the transcript and have them both be in the document. We don't need to check the transcript every time if the AI gets something wrong, but it's not the official record. The official record would be the recording from a, what happened at the meeting perspective if somebody tried to reproduce it. But for the purposes of having the full account there, that's the way that I would approach it. And that's how I would actually procedurally do it. It is have it first create a transcript and then ask it to summarize the transcript in 2 minutes and to keep the original.
Ms. Brosmer, and then Bill and Tom. Thank you.
I think Tyler's probably hit on where I would have gone with this because The problem I have with the discussion ensued encapsulation is that when I'm looking at the minutes of a meeting I have not attended, I want to know why the vote was what it was. And if we leave all of that out, then we might as well just say the vote was this, the vote was this, the vote was this on each agenda item and not put anything. So there has to be a happy medium in there somewhere. I like to know at least some of the rationale for why we got where we are. And so the summary strikes me as a good way to do that, because obviously we don't want to read through the entire 3 hours of what we said, because not everything is worthy of being repeated or reread. But to summarize it, I think would make the point and strike that balance.
Thank you, Bill.
And do we record, and it's, how long are we gonna keep the recording?
We do record, and I think once it's recorded, we have to keep it in accordance with the public records rules.
Is it
Typically
online?
7 years.
Yeah, there's one,
Goes
too.
online.
Great.
Do you have anything you want to add, Morgan?
You have the ability to have action minutes, which includes the motions, seconds, et cetera. You can include additional information that's helpful, it's not required. So you could have something of a hybrid where you're taking track of all motions and everything that needs to be included. And then if there's discussion regarding the purple lizards that you want to incorporate, you have the ability to do that.
Thank you. And AI could learn that.
Yeah, so I think if you all are okay with it, what we'll do for this meeting, we'll ask the IT folks that are doing this to give us what they think are the traditional minutes. They're the more brief, and the transcript, and we'll kind of see where we go. And of course, we can train it, right? This is outside of my area of expertise. But then we can provide both to you, and we could kind of talk about that if that's okay.
Are you, in that scenario, are you considering the traditional minute to be what Tyler was calling a summary?
It's the more abbreviated version. I don't know if summary is the right word, but it's
Okay.
Somebody came and gave a presentation about this topic, and it talks a little bit about that. The one we saw a sample of was the one where Josh from the Regional Planning Council was here. And so it kind of talked about what Josh told us. And then it said, well, member Malmberg had a question about XYZ, and then there was some discussion about that topic. And then, so that's the more traditional, I think, minutes. It wasn't like, and then he said this, and then he said this, and then he said
Right.
this, and then there was an action, right? It was a little more abbreviated, much more so than you're used to seeing, I think.
And that's what you're instructed to, or try to get it to produce.
I think we can maybe try to do both, and you guys can look at both if you're willing to do that, and kind of let us know where you want to fall on the spectrum of detail.
John and Tom?
Yeah, mine's not on AI, so it is on minutes. But I just think that when we list who's present as far as members, we don't list the staff that are present as well. I think we should capture staff in the minutes as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And because if we're using AI tools and not Chelsea doing it, right? Because Chelsea knows who's all here when she does the minutes. But if we're using AI, we really need to announce ourselves. We really need to use the microphones. And it did a pretty good job of figuring out who was who talking, surprisingly. But if there's anybody new that talks, that it might not, like, again, I don't know what it is, but anyway, stuff spit out and it was pretty decent on who was talking. But I think we need to be more cognizant of that going forward, because it is a machine telling us what happened. And of course, it doesn't replace the human aspect, right? Chelsea's going through them to make sure that what got spit out is accurate. And then, there's more QA, QC after that. So, but we do need to make sure that we speak clearly into the microphone, and if it's somebody that it doesn't know, we need to announce who that speaker is.
Tom?
Ginger, you glanced off of it. Does it have a name?
Oh, I don't know.
It needs a name. I mean, calling it just don't work.
I don't know. It's a program that our IT director created, so it's not like a commercial software.
We want Steve or whatever. Sorry.
I don't know, that creeps me out, to be honest, but,
Okay. We have a plan?
okay. So next time you might see two versions, an official version, we'll work through it, but we're in a period of transition. You might see a couple.
And speaking of
Iterations.
announcing ourselves, I see we have a visitor.
We do. So I guess now would be a good time to introduce all the staff that's here. So Ginger Dare, Environmental Management Director.
I'm Kelly Matter, Chief Claims Examiner for Building and Code Administration.
Urban Growth and Resource Management.
Morton Swank, County Attorney's Office.
Thad Gaither, County Engineer.
Ben Bartlett, Public Works Director.
Class Sustainability and Resilience Manager. Should we do Chelsea and?
Chelsea Moulton, Environment. Brianne Peterson, Growth and Resource.
Okay. We miss people?
IG.
Oh, you want to?
Jason Whitmer, Community Information.
All right, I think we can move on to the next item.
New business.
New business flood hazard management regulation overview.
Discussion.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I completely bleeped out there. Yes, discussion. So I'll do what I did last time. How many people watched or attended yesterday's council meeting? And particularly the last item, which was the discussion. Okay. We have by show of hands, Jack, John Geronimo, Jessica Gow, Bill Lights, Melissa Landers. Anybody in line? Wendy, were you there? Sarah Lee?
I was not there and I've been meaning to listen to it, but I haven't had a chance yet.
Sarah Lee?
No, I'm
Okay.
traveling.
Okay, thank you. So discussion we may now have.
So I put this on the agenda to talk about because we assumed that the discussion at yesterday's council meeting would pertain to the work plan here. So the agenda item was to discuss the 7 strategies that the council had voted on in lieu of the moratorium. And so we had a presentation, Clay, Paolo, and Ben presented about the 7 different strategies. 2 of them really pertain to the work we're doing, the no impacts to wetlands and no use of mitigation for wetland impacts. The others were about flooding and maintenance of canals, and Ben can talk about any of those that you want to talk about. But the end result was the meeting adjourned before they made any decisions. And so there was a pretty lengthy discussion about wetland impacts and wetland mitigation, but they did not provide any specific direction. So we're going to talk about it at the next council meeting now.
Per their rules, that will be the next available meeting will be April 15th, where they will finalize what their recommendations would be.
I did capture that they expressed interest in us returning, at least council member Santiago did, to trees. That was a light-hearted moment potentially. I just wanted.
I don't know if you caught.
Oh, go back and listen. It was there. And
Oh, no.
You guys snickered. I heard you.
We have visibly snickered, yes.
Yes.
But what you saw is that the council was listening to us in regards to some of the challenges that we had in the desired implementation that they were requesting. There's some, until they speak finally, we don't really know what they're going to be directing. Also, the conversation between filling on a development site, floodplain management, and wetlands got very blurred. We were trying to differentiate that because, again, as we said yesterday, not all floodplains are wetlands and not all wetlands are floodplains. And unfortunately, there was some misunderstanding of that. Yeah.
Bill,
And did they direct us to push up wetlands?
No, they did
Okay.
not, because they did not, as Clay just said, they did not conclude the discussion, so it'll be carried over to the April 15th meeting, which is a night meeting.
I thought it was really good to actually talk about all that and get it all out and understand, try to tease apart the wetlands versus floodplains versus spill. So
I found it helpful as well, and I found it a good refresher for what we learned about wetlands, which I hope to retain until next meeting.
So no action, but they did talk about, one of the slides was, where do you go from here on wetlands? And part of that is you go to ENRAC for recommendations and in 23, we spent 6 meetings on wetlands. You did make some recommendations on chapter 72, not on chapter 50. And we have it on our work plan. It's not first on the work plan, but it's there again for the annual work plan. It's listed as number 4. So we may have the council redirecting a little bit on the work plan. Don't know. They didn't, they didn't get there. But I would say it's a safe bet that wetlands are on the horizon for discussion. And we'll put another agenda item to recap the April 15th meeting at our May meeting.
So with that said, and Clay.
Just one quick kind of statement is that those of y'all who saw the presentation, there was a table that presented the summary of wetland impacts that have occurred in the unincorporated area over the last 2 years. And I think that's going to spur, and we heard coming from the council, a desire to look at chapter 50 and seeing what that could be done, because there was acknowledgement that the majority of the development that we see that folks are feeling are impacting wetlands are occurring within the cities. And so there may be an effort to try and look at what can be done from chapter 50 to again, put in place more strict standards or address some of the concerns that are coming from the public.
Thank you. So until next time, we have our priorities as we agreed to them at the beginning of the year, and that would make our new business completely correct at this time. So now we go into flood hazard management.
Yes, and I'm actually going to leave you because I have some deadlines coming up. So Samantha's going to take over, and Samantha and Kelly are going to give you all the information you need. You're in good hands, and I will see you all next month.
Thank you, Ginger.
Get us situated here. We're going to tag team this presentation. So today we're going to go over some basics, right? We're going to hit all of the floodplain management basics. We're going to go over definitions, what the different zones mean, the special flood hazard areas, and then policy. We're going to touch the federal, state, and our local ordinances that we have today. It's going to be a lot of information. Kelly is a certified floodplain manager, so that's why we have her on board. She knows all of the things. So if you have any questions, just as you normally do, feel free to stop us and we will answer them to the best of our ability. Okay.
Hello. I'm going to go over a few slides just about some floodplain management basics. With that being said, that will be floodplain mapping, the National Flood Insurance Program, community rating system, state floodplain management program, and Florida building codes and local ordinance. So looking at this picture, it basically shows a typical floodplain. You'll see there's a floodway in the center. We We have a few floodways throughout Volusia County. There's much more stringent requirements for development along a floodway. And then you see your base flood elevation as the next thing. The base flood elevation is very key to us for construction purposes when you apply for a permit and building. But I'll define some of those for you. So the floodplain is a flat area of land that's adjacent to a water source, such as a lake, river, or stream, subject to not only during a flood event, but times of heavy rain and high tides. You could have that. The floodway is actually like a channel, the channel, river, or water course, and the immediate adjacent land areas. It must be kept free of obstructions to allow floodwaters to pass without increasing the water surface elevation. So you don't want to build on it.
Would you turn your mic on, please?
It is on.
It's on.
Sorry about that.
And could we perhaps, two questions as you're proceeding? Will you be, I did look ahead, but I don't remember. Did you include these definitions in the deck, or can we get a notes view with the definitions? Is that possible?
We can send you a
Yeah.
notes view.
And it might be helpful if you have a laser pointer just to show if is normal channel the same as the floodway channel, just so we know on the diagram that it matches the words you're saying, and we understand that for the dumb kids in the room like me.
Okay, so there's the floodway. That's the one we were just talking about. That's going to be like your channels. And the flood fringe. The flood fringe is a portion of the floodplain located outside the floodway. It's going to experience more shallower, lower velocity floodwaters. And it can serve as a temporary storage as well. Now, the 1% annual chance flood hazard. This one's interesting, and there's a lot of confusion on it, especially when I'm dealing with residents that are building. They see that 1% and they assume I never flooded. I got 1% chance. What it actually means is you have a 1% chance, 1 out of 100 chance every year that you could experience this flooding event. And there is a 26% chance of flooding over the life of a 30-year mortgage. So it increases there too. So once you realize what it really means, then it becomes a little more serious.
But I do have one question, floodway. So everything in between the brackets are your floodway,
Yeah.
but the elevation on the right is higher than the elevation on the left. Wouldn't those be the same elevations?
Based on your topography.
Most of the.
Yeah.
Your points between the two?
Are you talking about the floodway itself?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
The floodway elevation would stay the same. The floodplain elevation outside of that could potentially change based on your topography. Floodway elevation should stay the same. Very correct.
Anything else? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so these are, we'll talk about the floodplain maps that we have to deal with. The flood insurance study, the FIS, is actually performed by FEMA. It's an engineering study. It determines a community's risk to flood hazards. It's developed based on historic information, hydraulic, hydrologic, meteorologic, topographic data. So they create this flood insurance study. The results of this study will then show up on the FIRM, the flood insurance rate map, and that's what engineers use to determine a base flood elevation. All this information's on there, and we have a sample map here where the green is your zone AEs, and there will be we look for a little squiggly line that will actually give us the elevation. There are two things when we're talking about flood zones. There's A, which is undetermined, and then there's AE, such as this. You'll see the green AE is determined. That means that a study was done. It's on the flood insurance rate map. A base flood elevation has been determined for that area. A lot of our county is actually in the undetermined A zone, which means no studies have been done. You cannot find it on an insurance rate map. at that point, what we do, up in plan review is when we have to get an elevation certificate for development in the flood zone, it's gonna require that surveyor to also contact an engineer to conduct independent study of that property based on the same information to determine a base flood elevation. So your undetermined A zones are gonna require a little bit more work than simply just pulling up a map. At some point, FEMA, I'm sure will update the maps, but they're never in a real big hurry to do those things, so. Okay, and then the special flood hazard area. We have all these different zones. Yeah, you're good. The most that we see, I'm not gonna read the whole thing to you for each one. The ones that we focus on the most is X. Unshaded is a lot of what we have. That's basically when you're building an X zone, you're not in a flood zone. It's above the 500-year limit, and it's outside the 500-year flood. So you have the 100-year, you have a 500-year, and anything outside of that goes to your X zone. So if you're building an X, you're good. You don't need the flood insurance or anything like that. And we do have a few X shaded areas that are questionable, but and then here's where we talk about the A and AE zones. That just defines basically what I had just said. It used to be the AE zones were called what they say below the A 1 through 30. That's how the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, determined insurance rates based on the zones that you were in. They no longer do that anymore. So now it's just AE and A. We do have AH areas in our county. That's mostly dealing with shallow water. You'll find that around ponds, any body of water that's less than 3 feet, where there can be standing water, but nothing, devastating. Those are your AH zones. The only time I ever really see those zones come up oddly is around mobile home parks. I'm not sure why that is, but that's how it is on our map, so. Is there any questions about the different flood zone? Good. Okay.
I have one other, storm surge. How does that play into your flood maps as well? Just, you don't have to give a big explanation, but I'd like to know how that comes into play.
Well, that's more in we have these VE zones. That's gonna be all your coastal stuff. When we're developing in the VE zone, rather than going off of, and this is building code related and DEP. We no longer go off of what the base flood elevation is for that area. We're going off what the 100-year storm elevation is, which is always higher than your flood elevation. That's where that comes in.
Okay.
It's in the building code as well. It'll specify that if you're developing seaward of the CCCL, or in the VE zone, or both, it gives you the option. Here's 3 scenarios of what elevation to develop at, but it has to be whichever is greater. And my experience, every time the 100-year storm is greater.
And just for clarification, in the state of Florida, along the coast, specifically in Volusia County, we have the Coastal Construction Control Line, which is what just Kelly referenced, the CCCL. This is a state established line, which anything seaward has to undergo specific construction methods to assure that it can withstand the storm event. Typically what that results is pier and piling type of construction, so that way there's nothing that can be dragged away when the ocean comes running through. It can basically crash through and allow for the pilings to remain.
And like Clay was just talking, a little bit later on, you'll see some slides that have to do with that coastal construction and breakaway walls and things like that too.
This is personal. I'm in there, and but it's interesting. I had to do a slab, right? Breakaway. And it's cut into 4 by 4 feet by 6 inches. So if storm surge comes through, and it did in Ian, in theory, those 12 slabs are going to be where? my neighbor's yard, mosquito lagoon, under the bridge, in every canal, I mean, and I think and they also do, the other thing they have is breakaway walls, you know, and what happens when they break away? I mean, where's all that trash go? Who's responsible for it?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, those are things when we look at what we might do, the sense of this breakaway stuff, it's a little question.
Mhm.
I just want to caution, we have nothing to do with that. We have no capability of changing the standards established for the CCL, unfortunately.
Personally.
Yep, I get it. Okay. That was going.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out on the map here, all of the zones that Kelly was just talking about, so zone A is the majority of what we have in Volusia County, that's the purple that you see. The zone AE is this tan-ish color you're seeing, and it's really hard to see on this map, obviously it's county scale. We have a little bit of zone AH, that she was speaking about, right in this area. Zone VE is obviously gonna be in our coastal areas, and then zone X.
Okay, so, these map change letters, they can be beneficial. So letter of map amendment is one of them. We also call it a LOMA. Typically, this type of letter, is used when you need the map to be amended because there was an error. You were incorrectly placed in a flood zone and it was determined that it's not a flood zone. They will amend the map, bringing you out of it. The other one we have is letter of map revision. We call that a LOMAR. That's gonna be, we do get these, not on a regular basis, but typically when we get them, it's because you have someone that's on, let's say, 5 acres and they brought in fill specific to the building footprint and they developed at least a foot above the base flood elevation. And they don't want to have to be subject to the insurance and all the requirements. They'll do a letter of map revision. The community gets involved. We have to sign off acknowledging that it's reasonably safe from flooding based on how it's built. And that helps get them out of that flood zone as well. But it's specific to the structure, not the property. And so it's only going to look at where that structure is sitting. The rest of the property could still be a flood zone, but the structure is not part of that. The next one is, this is where I talked about just now, LOMAR F. That's where fill is brought in. You are doing a LOMAR because you've brought in fill and you've developed up out of the base flood elevation. And I should say the previous one, the LOMA without the fill, you might have that, or the LOMAR without the fill, when they've done a stem wall or something like that, and not brought all this fill in. And then you have the LOMAR, which is a conditional letter of map revision. That the applicant goes directly to FEMA for, because it's a condition. It's a condition that as long as you do these things, after you develop, get checked, then it'll be considered for a LOMAR, but it's a conditional letter.
So a lot of times whenever we do site plan or subdivision development, the applicant will come in and maybe where they're proposing is currently in a floodplain, but the proposal will take it out of the floodplain. So they're gonna go ahead and go to FEMA, go through this application process, say, hey, this is what I'm gonna propose, is this okay? And then they will go through the LOMAR process after they bring the fill in or however they're planning on getting it out of the floodplain. So it's just one of the steps.
Well, what Samantha just described as a selling point for the developer to sell the lots, we will be out of the flood zone when it's built.
Is that?
Says also apply. I'm thinking of an article that was in the News Journal a few weeks ago about homeowners in New Smyrna that had retrofitted their home and property. Let's say that they had a mortgage and they wanted to get out from under a requirement to have flood insurance. Would this process apply to them?
I mean, if it's an existing structure, it has to meet the minimum 1 foot above the base flood elevation.
Which you can't do with a.
Right. And unfortunately, residential structures are not allowed to have dry flood proofing either. So I'm not sure how they would go about doing that. There is an option if you get the right engineer that knows how to elevated, the existing structures. Some are capable of doing that and some are not.
Yeah, and
I don't think they did that, but just various mitigation techniques they've taken.
Yeah, and one that I've seen after Ian, that's common up in Ormond, is people are building a second story and then the bottom they're opening up to garage and storage. So that's another way to do it.
And those different mitigation strategies will not take them out of the floodplain. It'll take the structure out of the floodplain, but the map itself will not change unless they go through this process. We've had single lots come in before just with a regular LOMAR because they're, or a LOMA, because their property, they had someone come in, had an engineer come in, determine that they were outside of the floodplain, but the map said they were in it. So they have the ability to come in and say, hey, no, I'm actually not, here's all my documentation. And then it'll take them out of the floodplain on the official map, so they do not have to have flood insurance. So there are ways, but the other ways are, you're gonna have to change the property itself, right?
Tyler.
So there's a couple of these examples that I've had like in my career. One of them, it was a zone A. So at the beginning of the presentation, she mentioned zone A is unstudied. We performed a detailed study and removed a lot of structures from the zone A designation and created a zone AE. So that's one path that a homeowner could have without having to lift their structures if it is a zone A and it's an incorrect designation, like Sam was saying. The other option that we have explored is a lot, especially like East Volusia, a lot of our flatland areas are drained by canal systems. And those canal systems often have choke points that's a box culvert or something else going under a roadway. So you can go upgrade one of those and take an entire neighborhood out of the floodplain by dropping the effective stage and hydraulic grade line in those ditches. We've done that type of stuff as well. But other than that, there's not a lot of relief for a homeowner, especially if you're on the intercoastal or on the major drainage system and not a man-made network. So.
Okay, so that's, with these letters, you can see how much acreage was added to the floodplain and how much was removed from the floodplain since 2017, which is quite a bit. Which is good to do.
Yep. I have a question. A University of Miami study, I'm reading this, found that 21% of housing built in Florida, and I realize we're talking about Volusia County, all Florida between 2001 and 2019 was within the 100-year floodplain. So what I'm understanding up until now is we can take properties. So I have no idea if that study means that they were in the floodplain, but they took action that took them out of the floodplain. I didn't know you could get out of the floodplain. And your neighbor could be in the floodplain is what I'm hearing, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that was essentially it. I can be in the neighborhood, but take myself out of the neighborhood. Tad.
On Skynet. So, part of the issue with the floodplain is that back when they originally set up these maps, they didn't have the detailed contour information that we currently have. So they were using, when they ran these models, basically the 5-foot contours on the USGS maps. And they weren't bad, they just aren't anywhere near as accurate. So part of what happens is FEMA on a semi-regular basis, when they get a burn their saddle, they'll go through and update. This last time when they updated in 2014 to 2017 timeframe, we being the county, have provided our 1-foot LiDAR contours. And now they're able to go ahead and update that. So instead of prorating between 2 5-foot contours, they're able to actually shift and adjust in those areas where we know exactly where the floodplain elevation is defined to match that line. So in some cases, part of what you'd see in a change, why some of the homes came out was simply because the contour map that everything was based on was incorrect. So in some of those cases, that's a portion of the adjustment. You also, as you go through and do the flood studies, like Tyler was talking about, then you're actually getting an accurate read on what that elevation was. All the zone A areas, and I don't know what the modeling software they used at the time, but they they did something back in the fifties and came up with these rough approximations for what the elevation for the floodplain was. They are, they're not inaccurate, but they're not highly accurate. And that's why you have to go perform a study to identify what that actual elevation is. It could be a couple of feet either way, and in a flat state like Florida, when you're changing contour lines, that 2 feet could be a difference of 100 feet in terms of your horizontal location. It can change quite a bit. So the history plays into a lot of the numbers, and when you try to compare, well, these number of acres came in or came out, there's different reasons for that. And I wouldn't just take the statistics at face value. There'd be some questions that would be raised if I were looking at it to go, removing 8,000 acres. Well, that sounds like we've just played games. And I don't know where the new acreage would have come from either. Those are really big numbers. So I'd be really curious as to how that actually occurred, other than cleaning up versus the contour lines overall.
So just to reiterate, make sure I understand that. Garbage in, garbage out. Part of changes could be the result of better measurement techniques and establishing better understanding of the topography.
Right.
And some of it, and that would be no man-made alteration whatsoever necessarily. That's just a better read of the terrain. And the other we can also influence as human beings and do man-made things that would change a floodplain. So both of those are
Correct.
possibilities, and we don't know up there which.
Right.
The extent of the data supporting.
I don't know the answer, but I'd have a hard time believing that there were 6,000 acres of development that caused the difference between the 2,000 and the 8,000 there. That's a large amount of development. I can't imagine that we've done that since 2017. In the cities, unincorporated areas combined, I would have a hard time believing that. So, I think it's more about being more accurate with your information. But one thing to keep in mind too is that these floodplain maps, we do know that there are, depending on the definition of floodplain you use, and staff have indicated the definition for you all, it's tied to water bodies. FEMA, though, also takes a look at areas that are not tied to water bodies. So we talked about it a couple of different times in our stormwater conversations about closed basins. Closed basins are not connected to water bodies in every situation, but they will flood during a 100-year storm. And so when you take a look at the FEMA definition, it does factor that aspect in, and it's basically the area that floods in that 100-year storm. So the maps themselves do not reflect that. So, you see a white area there for DeLand, Orange City, west of Tiger Bay, but east of the St. Johns River, there should be more dots in there to indicate these closed basins. And the water is piling up in those areas. And we talk about like Miller Lake, we talked about over there off of Taylor Road, several other areas that have come up that they are, in point of fact, they are floodplain because water does pond in that area, but that's not what FEMA was targeting when they originally did these maps. And even after they got the contours, they didn't go back in and add that in. And that's one of the things that we probably need to take a look at in terms of the next round of modifications to the stormwater rule, is putting something in there specific to identify those closed basin issues and make sure that anything that gets designed in those areas is properly accounting for that particular situation.
Thank you.
Melissa, can you jump into the question queue when I get a chance?
Yes, Wendy.
Thank you.
Bill's ahead of you.
Okay.
And then are we going to get to the point where we talk about floodplain impacts? Because the way I understand it as a layperson is you have floodplain, and depending on the depth or the elevation and the topography going down. So in some places you have deep floodplains, and then it tapers up to a very, very small area. And when a developer designs or a civil engineer designs the floodplain impacts, they also have to compensate for them. And cup for cup is what they use. And I'm going to slaughter this because this is just layman. But if you impact a small, 2 inches of the floodplain here, you have to go somewhere else and excavate to make that floodplain whole like it was before. So this concept of no development in floodplains, it's kind of misguided because yes, you might be putting it in a small bit of floodplain, but you're compensating for it and changing that part because it's no longer in the floodplain because you filled, right, with your LOMA or your CLOMA or whatever.
Wendy.
So that's what I wanted to follow up on, and thank you for bringing that up, Bill. The compensating storage point is a good point, but does the compensating storage, depending on where you put that on your site, does it really capture all of that, diverted floodplain water? Because, I think that's what we are hearing from the homeowners in older homes that have flooded, that when a new development comes in, builds on fill, it is displacing water that, used to ride along in that floodway or, flood zone, that then got filled. And even if there is some sort of compensation that was engineered into it, some of those floodwaters seem to be sort of shifting or accumulating someplace else, whether that's because the filled, site created a dam of sorts. It isn't just that, they're catching their stormwater. You know what I'm saying? It's somehow or another, floodwater is being relocated onto other people. I mean, that's what we're hearing people say. That's what we're seeing. So I guess a question for Kelly is, if you do a revision, Lomar, to revise the maps for the properties that got filled, does it also kind of trickle out to rewrite the maps for other nearby properties that might be more at risk than they used to be?
Ed wants to take a stab at that, and then Jessica.
Yeah, what I would say with regard to that aspect is, if a property comes in, single family home in an existing subdivision, I think it's the situation you're referencing, like something in Daytona Park Estates where the lot was created a long time ago prior to any stormwater rules, and people have built homes in there, and now you've got people coming in prior to our current rules, and now you've got people coming in trying to build under our current rules. The situation in a lot of those is if there's floodplain on the maps, then we go ahead and we do require the cup for cup on those lots. And if they can't do it, then they can't build there. The issue is that quite a few of those do not have floodplain shown, and the storms that we've had are above 100-year storms. So yeah, you're probably going to have more water and have that kind of flooding where if they fill that volume, it's a problem. But under the 100-year, they'd be just fine. So heck, we have one that we were just talking about before it came into this meeting before lunch, where we've got that same situation. Somebody wants to build on an old lot. The lot is in the floodplain over on the east side of the county. And we're going to tell them, look, you have to replace cup for cup, everything that's in there. Now, if you went 2 lots over, there's another lot that's vacant, it's above the floodplain, that would be fine. Now, you take a look at what the elevation is on that versus, the storms from Ian or Milton, any of those 3 hurricanes where the volumes were higher than the 100-year flood, then those probably would have had water. But the landmark that the county currently uses, and just about everybody uses, is the 100-year floodplain. If we want to talk about changing that, that's always a possibility, but that's what the current standard is with regard to those. So it's not that the 100-year is wrong, it's just it may not be adequate to handle the current situation.
I don't want to speak out of turn. I just wanted to note too, when we talk about floodplain and then flow to offsite neighbors, I think part of that gets into the stormwater kind of rate of discharge discussion that we've had tangled up. Because my understanding of comp storage is it has to be connected hydrologically, but it doesn't have to be within the same site. And so you may not be compensating for your floodplain impacts on your own property, as long as it's, within the same basin or adjacent in rare cases, and it's hydraulically connected. So the the water flowing off-site is not necessarily what's being mitigated with comp storage. It's the overall floodplain capacity. The water flowing off-site is tied into rate of discharge for stormwater regulations.
And in theory, that's not a bad idea. It's pretty much the same thought as wetland mitigation. But in this case, if you don't do it in a close enough location, it's very easy to change how flooding works in terms of how it moves through an area overall. And then you're back more similar to a situation like Wendy was mentioning. So if it's not on an adjacent property tied into that same exact area, I, as an engineer, would not be comfortable doing mitigation for floodplain impacts very far away, because you will change the flow characteristics and where water piles up based on several different factors, including topography and buildings and so on and so forth. But
Thank you.
So just, I'm sorry to interrupt your presentation, but this highlights that there are really kind of three components about flooding that we have been talking about and need to continue talking about: wetlands, floodplain, and stormwater treatment. Those three things together, or not together, but separate, is what we need to consider.
Great, we're good to continue. So we are transitioning over into some policy and start with federal. Unless you have any further questions on this floodplain management basics. Okay. All right, we're going to talk about the National Flood Insurance Program. This is a program that is run by FEMA, so federal government. There are different parts to it. There's different roles. The FEMA has their own role, state has their own role, and local government has their own role. We'll talk about each of those. As you can see on the screen, they look at the entire program. They have minimum requirements to be in the program and what you have to do as a state and local government. So they're identifying that flood risk. They have those basic maps, right, that we were talking about. They provide some technical assistance. They're always encouraging mitigation and providing that federal flood insurance coverage. So the majority of flood insurance coverage within Florida is going to be a National Flood Insurance Program backed policy. There are private insurers that people can have their flood insurance through most of the time. I'm not really sure about right now. Most of the time it is more expensive to go through a private insurer, but you might get broader coverage and things of that sort.
Excuse me, I looked that up yesterday
Yes.
because I'm not required to have flood insurance, but I'm one of those risk averse people that buys it. And apparently you can, FEMA itself does not administer, they don't underwrite the policies. You have to go through a private insurer to get that coverage.
But there are, you can have insurance that's not backed by FEMA. It's not a part of the
yeah.
National Flood Insurance Program. Because there are, as we can see, there are communities that may not be a part of the NFIP, which is the National Flood Insurance Program. So if you're not a part of it, you cannot have that flood insurance. State's role?
Excuse me real quick.
Yeah.
Just for clarification, since we're talking about flood insurance, there's been changes in how they do the assessment. Just because you're in the floodplain doesn't necessarily mean you're the only one who has to get flood insurance. So when you start hearing some of the mortgage companies, because what was it, a year or so ago, Kelly, they did risk rating 2.0. So therefore, I also, who live on the barrier island, I'm just waiting for the note that, yes, I will have to have some sort of flood insurance, because even though I'm out of the floodplain, I may be at a higher risk. And so they're using factors that they won't disclose. It all feeds into the model. They shake the chicken bones over top of it. And now comes the answer as to whether or not you have to or don't have to have flood insurance. Just want to make sure that everyone understands that from a plain simple mortgage and insurance perspective.
Yeah, I think they had about maybe at that same time when that was in the news, there were both climate people and insurance people saying anybody in Florida would do well to have flood insurance, period.
True.
Yeah, I think it's important to identify that those special flood hazard areas are just a level of risk. There is nowhere in the state of Florida that does not have any risk of flooding. So moving on to the state's role in the NFIP is that they have their own program oversight, and that's where you get some higher standards, and we'll talk about the Florida Building Code in a bit. A lot of their standards come through there, and they administer a lot of the federal mitigation grant programs. A lot of the time, the state is our in-between with the federal government for any changes to our floodplain ordinance. And once we get into our local regulations and requirements, we'll talk about if we have to have any changes to that. It does need to go to the state, which will be our go-between between FEMA to make sure whatever changes we make are in compliance with the NFIP. So community's role, you would have to adopt your own local floodplain ordinance, which Volusia County has. So we are within the NFIP. We provide technical assistance to citizens and inspect and maintain records. That's what the Land Development Office does. That's what Building and Code Compliance does. One of Kelly's main roles is looking to make sure that structures coming in are in compliance. So this is just a brief description, bullet points of if you're in the NFIP, these are the great things that happen. If you are not, then like we said before, you won't be able to obtain NFIP flood insurance. You'd have to go out to that private provider. You also, the physical and financial exposure for the losses, you're not going to be eligible for certain grant funding. So there's a lot of negative things as to why you should be within that NFIP. Now, a part of this kind of segues off of the National Flood Insurance Program, that if you want to go above and beyond those minimum requirements, then you can be a part of the community rating system. It's a voluntary program that communities can opt to be within, and unincorporated Volusia County and 10 other cities within Volusia County are a part of the community rating system. In essence, it gets you a discount or gets our citizens a discount on their flood insurance based on those additional regulations or requirements you put into the code. Yeah, so discount from 5 to 45% in the 11 local governments. This book, it is a huge certification that the county has to go through every couple of years. There's all the requirements within the CRS that you can get points for. And it's a huge feat. We're actually going through a cycle visit within the next 2 weeks. And Kelly is heading that up. She's super excited.
Similar to the audit by the IRS.
Yes, yeah, it is a full-scale audit.
It's quite a bit. But fortunately, unincorporated Volusia County we do really good. We have an excellent rating. And as you see, our residents down there at the bottom get a 25% insurance discount on the national flood insurance, and that's the people that's got the NFIP participation. On participation, you go private, you don't get all that,
So what you want to do here is in the CRS, the Community Rating System Program, the lower the number, the better, right? So if you're doing bare minimum, you're level 10, and then you can go all the way up, right? So we have a lot of communities that are level 5 or rated as a 5, as you can see. And we have some communities that, joined at a later date, so they're catching up with the rest of us. So what happens is that the county has a community rating system coordinator. So there's a full-time position that's dedicated to this program, along with other planning functions, and it is their job to make sure that we are meeting all those requirements. The majority of the cities also have someone, it's tacked onto an additional job, that have to do their CRS program as well. And they all collaborate throughout the year and do outreach and all that good stuff. Any questions on the community rating system? We went through it fast, or the NFIP, because we're about to move on to state policy.
One question, Dave. I know that the only city in there from the west side of the county is Deltona. I don't see Berry, I don't see Orange City, I don't see DeLand. Is that because they're loading up on a ridge, or just because they're cheap?
Well, participation in CRS is optional. They don't have to do it. I believe Orange City doesn't even have any flood zones. I think that's the city that doesn't even have it, and DeLand does not participate in the CRS program.
No, and from what I'm aware, DeLand is working on, their plan is to participate. That's what I've heard in the past year or so. Go ahead, Clay.
Snickering.
Yeah, that's definitely flooding. Yes. Yeah, and then very annoying.
Yeah, when the CRS program came out, it was primarily coastal cities that really jumped on it because as you can see, they were the ones that were subject to a lot of the flooding that occurred early with 2004 with Charlie Francis and Gene. So.
Good to move on. Transitioning over to state.
So FDEM, it's the Florida Division of Emergency Management. They are the coordinating agency of the NFIP, so we have to work with them, report with them. Currently, because of the back-to-back hurricanes and the flooding we sustained, the 15th of every month, I'm actually required to report to them updates on any permits that have come in for repairs who got flooded, because there's also a thing called substantial damage that we have to make sure we're applying to every permit too. What's good about FDEM though is they also have fast track a new grant process. So if you did flood and you have an FIP and you wanted to do mitigation and to get your house out of it, either rebuild or elevate, you could apply for a grant through FEMA. And if you have NFIP, there's also a thing called increased cost of compliance where they grant you the 30,000. And then you would apply for, it's an HMGP, I believe it's called, grant with FEMA. Bad news about that, and we learned all this back in EN, is that was a 5-year process. They have now stepped up and I think it becomes effective June, they're gonna start doing it, but FDEM's come out with Elevate Florida, and these grants are actually going through within 6 months. So that's really good for our residents that have been beat up with 2 floodings and are just over it, ready to do something, but they don't want to lose their home either. We've incorporated their requirements. Luckily, the Florida Building Code is recognizing that, so they do have put it in the Florida Building Code, which we're going to talk about next. It makes my job easier because when you're trying to implement these things and you can actually have an actual building code that backs it up for it. So the building codes that we look at, basically for residential, it's chapter 322, chapter 3, I'm sorry, section 322 has to do with the flooding. So one thing we look at when it 322.1.6, protection of mechanical, plumbing, electrical equipment, we want to make sure HVAC, right, that you're at least a foot above the base flood elevation. You don't want your utilities to go up underneath. We are doing flood reviews and requirements on whole home generators. I do have some people get aggravated about this, but in a flood event, if it's not above the base flood elevation and it goes under, guess what? You got a generator, you paid all this money for it. So we want to make sure those things work for you. So you are required to elevate whole home generators now as well. Elevation requirements, what we talk about, buildings and structures shall have lowest floor elevated to 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Attached garages are allowed to go below the base flood elevation as long as they have flood openings. So most people opt to put the whole thing above, but I do have some that come in and they got the habitable space is 1 foot above and the garage is not. They have to do flood openings. And there's requirements on that too, how many you need, how they're supposed to be installed. Detached accessory structures, they just implemented this in this cycle of the building code, and it's been in our ordinance, so it's been kind of hard to enforce it without people getting angry, but now it's in the building code that detached accessory structures, if they're over 600 square feet, they got to meet new building requirements, 1 foot above base flood elevation. So if you have a shed or something that's 500 square feet, you are allowed to do flood openings in there. But you're getting a metal building that's 700 square feet and up, it's got to be elevated as well. And it's the challenge that we run into because of the perception of people is all I'm doing is parking lawnmowers in there. Who cares? They don't understand the effect that it has on the floodplain. So you have to kind of explain that part to them.
I have no idea of the square footage of the sheds that people buy and put in their backyards, but those are under 600 square.
And actually, most of the manufacturers that I deal with, the plans come in, they do have flood plans that come with the sheds because they're aware of that too. So it's easy on the customer. I just tell them, when you need to submit the plans, the beer shed has a whole sheet. It's got the 1 inch per 1 square foot, one on opposite side and how they're supposed to be installed. So they're aware of that too.
Thank you.
It sounds silly, or a lot of times the resident will get stressed out. Oh my gosh, I gotta do all this stuff. And I try to make it easy on them, say, just give them a call and know exactly what you're talking about. And sure enough, they do. So.
I think it's important to point out, we started with federal, so that's gonna be the more broad policy and regulations. And now we're getting the state, they're gonna be more restrictive. That 1 foot above that base flood elevation, that's a state requirement, is not an FIP requirement. So as we keep going, we'll see, get to our local ordinance, it'll be even more restrictive, right?
And my favorite one, the BE zones, coastal construction. We kind of talked about this earlier, that the elevation is to be based on the 100-year storm elevation, which is higher than the base flood elevation. So the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member, which is typically your grade beam, should be at or above the base flood elevation plus 1 foot. This is also where you get into the breakaway, frangible walls, frangible slabs and all that too. The foundations over on the coast have to be on pilings. Next one. You'll see, I put this picture in here to give you an idea when you drive around and see these houses like that. It's because of all these codes.
So this is, now I'm personal, following John's example. I live on the barrier island in a house that's going to be 60 in June. My parents bought it when it was new. And a lot of homes in the North Peninsula, unincorporated Volusia County, are up on they do look like this, some of the newer homes. Is there an easy map on our website to see where that coastal, because I've understood that we have sort of a forced retreat if your home is damaged to 50% or greater of the replacement cost. When you rebuild, you have to rebuild to this standard. But I have not easily found a coastal construction line map.
We do, it's in our GIS mapping.
Yeah, we have a JRM interactive map on our website.
Okay,
That's
yes.
the coast
Okay,
construction plan.
I'll look there. Thank you.
Yeah, I can come out, like New Smyrna's, things start getting a little scary, but like in the Port Orange and Daytona Beach Shores area, it's like he said, it's.
I'm almost in plywood.
Yeah.
Pretty far.
So
Yeah, and I want to say that the breakaway and those types of things, and if I'm not mistaken, that's because of that hydrostatic pressure. I think that's the right term, so that the entire structure doesn't float away, right? Bigger issue if you have the whole house moving as opposed to a couple of breakaway walls.
Right, so you got your wave run up and things like that. That's required, so you can.
Jessica had a.
Just a quick, because I think this type of construction and stem wall construction comes up a lot. Can you talk a little bit about how raising the structures and the necessary elements interact where you're served with septic? Where that kind of doesn't work?
If the structure in a flood zone with the septic, so obviously the health department has their own requirements. And if you're in a flood zone, 9 times out of 10, you're gonna see that giant Indian mound out in the front yard. So they regulate that. When you're talking about plumbing with the elevating equipment, is that kind of what you're?
It's mostly on the septic system itself, right? So we've heard from a policy perspective and resident concerns of let's stop bringing in fill to properties, let's build on stem walls. But we have large chunks of unincorporated Volusia and our local governments that are served by septic still.
Yes.
And so the struggle is if you can't bring in fill, you can't put in a septic system that meets the requirements.
Yeah, we're running into that in Daytona Park Estates. We've administratively, I've made a determination that countywide, if you are building in a floodplain on a single family lot that's vested, you have to utilize stem wall construction or a similar type of method. Which is all said and good because then you minimize the amount of fill for the actual foundation of the home. The problem that you run into is exactly what you just said. Now I have to have a driveway that will get me into the garage or carport that's associated with. So I've got to fill for my driveway to get myself from the road onto my garage. Then, in order to meet the clearance, the health department is concerned about the depth of the groundwater table. You have to be a set distance above that so that the water or the septic can filtrate through the ground and hopefully not create any problems with the groundwater. So that's why you see that they have to have those bounded. So our efforts to minimize the filling required for the home, we're doing okay. But there's just a factual aspect of driveways and garage and septic systems that are causing fill on site.
And I believe the health department, I thought that was transitioning to,
Yeah, that's,
FDEP. Hasn't happened yet, I guess.
it's going to the DEP. It will no longer be permitted out of the Volusia County Health Department. It will be out of Orlando's Department of Environment.
Well, and two other things, because I have a real passion for sewage. Just me. If you do have to bring in that fill, the health department has required you to have an on-site advanced wastewater treatment rather than a regular traditional septic system, which has different costs associated with it because it has to be maintained on a yearly basis. And the other thing I found out, because I do have this passion for sewage, I was very shocked and sad to find out when I had to replace my drain field a couple of years ago that because my home was built before 1985, my distance from the water table is grandfathered in, and I can pollute like it's 1965, baby. With pardon? Yeah. So when you look at old housing stock in somewhere like the North Peninsula, it's just going to be as bad as it's going to be for a long time.
So on the septic thing, that's a really good question in the drain field because it has to be 12 inches, the bottom of the gravel or the drain field has to be 12 inches above the seasonal height. That's this, or 18. But that's the same seasonal high as we're using for the discharge for the stormwater system. So how are they dealing with that? If you have to you want to limit fill, and let's say you have a entitled lot, and it's even wetlands, and you have to do stem wall, but you have to then have a pad for your drain field. Are you allowed to do that?
Yeah, we're allowing for
Gotcha.
the simple fact is that we cannot have a regulation that takes the use of the property at this point.
And with DEP taking over, it's possible that that will change. There are things called a performance-based treatment system. And it's almost a self-contained wastewater system. It treats itself in the tank. Before it goes to the drain field, it reduces your setbacks, it reduces your height requirements from groundwater. And essentially, by the time it gets out to these little half-inch lines that look like irrigation lines, it's been self-treated water. And I've seen them before, they almost act like a sprinkler system in these homes. They right now are being utilized where there's not a whole lot of room to put in an entire septic system because it reduces the size and they're quite costly, but hopefully, that's something that DEP will kind of enforce too, if in a flood zone.
And they're costly, and there's something that communities need to consider when they're given the opportunity to go into sanitary sewer and they decide not to because water flows uphill into the ocean. In the estimation of many. I wanted to mention too that after, we talk about flooding not occurring so much on the east side of the county, but after Milton, the first time since I've been back here and reading next door, people were complaining that their septic systems were backing up into their yards because the water table had risen so high. So even though people weren't having problems with flooding per se in their homes, they're seeing in an area that doesn't traditionally flood the impact of lots of rain. That's just a side note.
All right, any further questions on building code state requirements? Go on the local. So the local floodplain management regulations, it rests with the local community. Granted by state statutes, and it's sprinkled throughout all of our documents. It's within our comprehensive plan, it's within our land development code. And as always, it's to address the public health, safety, and welfare of our citizens. So you received an email that directed you to the website with all of the additional documentation. I went through the comprehensive plan and highlighted the areas that referenced floodplain or special flood hazard area, so that on your own time, you can go through and look to see all of those things. Here, I've just identified those elements in our comp plan that reference the floodplain or flood hazard areas. See, it is sprinkled throughout multiple elements. And then there are two divisions really that it's talked about within our Chapter 72 Code of Ordinances. One is the Division 4, Design and Construction Standards of Improvements. A lot of these standards are implemented by TADS Group over in Development Engineering and then Traffic Engineering. Going to touch on them because you also received these. I don't want to bore you and read every single word. Basically, you should not be subdividing or developing land without having flood control measures on a property, because we want flood-free development and flood-free vehicular access to the site. That's a big thing that we look at when a commercial project or a subdivision comes in, is especially that flood-free vehicular access and the development itself. So whether that be individual lots or the structure for the commercial site, however it is. Let's see, first floor elevation must be at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation, which is really just the same thing that the what a building code says. There are a little bit more specific requirements, but it's really talking about the platted lot and speaks to the regulatory floodway.
And John has a comment, John Geronimo.
Just a question, does anybody know where the 1 foot came from? The basis of it? Or was it arbitrary in 1954, and we're still doing it?
I couldn't tell you when it was enacted, but I don't believe this was enacted in the 1954. When they originally set the maps, they were just identifying the maps. They weren't putting these regulations quite in place. Those have come since then. The building code is really where it's established, associated with the structures, and I think that was after Andrew. I don't think that was in place prior to Andrew.
And as part of the fire standard we talked about in the NFIP.
My question is, it's 1, but
Correct.
why isn't it 2? It's 4, 3.
Actually, the transform 386 funding, any house that's redone with that has to be 2 feet above the floodplain. So the federal government has adjusted there.
Broward County has also gone through an exhaustive analysis. They use an exhaustive USGS-based study of the flood water or groundwater factored in, sea level change factored in, storm surge, and has identified that in some areas they can require upwards of 4 feet, depending on your location.
And they've got a great website on resilience, their county website.
Yes.
Burbank.
Thank you. The 1 foot is a magic number that nobody can determine. Another one we have that we deal with is the 35% rule. Most of our land development code says you can't have over 35% of your lot as being impervious. And as yet, unless somebody here can explain that to me, I don't know where that number came from either. Tad, nobody?
My thoughts on it, and it's just a thought on it, was that was really before the stormwater rules were in place. The stormwater rules were non-existent really until 1983, and I think that was really just a means to try to cut down on impervious surface. And that's just it, because if you go by the stormwater rules, I don't know why there would need to be a percentage established for a particular lot. Because you make an assumption much higher than 35% per lot in your stormwater calculation.
And I want to clarify the 35% is building area, not impervious. So it does not, we understand that impervious can take upwards of 80% of the lot when you factor in the setbacks. So if you build to your setbacks for both accessory structures like a pool, decks, all that fun stuff, you're getting into 75 to 80% impervious on a residential lot, given that it's a standard builder's quarter acre.
Yeah, but a lot of the city zonings, at least ours that
Yeah.
included, do have a maximum impervious, not just building area, but maximum impervious per lot. But I think that, again, that's a holdover from pre-stormwater. That's just a guess.
Yep.
Thank you. I mean, the reason for this, I think we're dealing with two things, right? We're dealing with how can we deal with existing structures and the things we've done in the past? Right, what can we do? There's not a lot we can do, but we're trying to do. But the other part is how do we prevent things in the future? And that's where the code and that's where we might be able to have an impact. You know, if the future may look a little brighter than the past.
I think that's part of the substantial damage assessments we have to do too, is FEMA NFIP gets tired of paying out these monies on a home that's a repetitive loss or flooded 2 times. So now they want people to come up with everyone else in the new standards. So they've got these grants and increased costs of compliance. So I personally feel that's one way to help these older homes come up to current standards. As they come in, and we had a ton of them come in for repairs and they exceed that 50%, it's okay, you gotta either rebuild or elevate. So, you know, and it's a house built in 1970. And so personally, I feel that's one way to help get everybody up at some point. I'm still.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Being screwed with this.
Okay, next section of Division 4 really talks about the roadway sections and street elevations. As you can see, it states that it has to be at least 1 foot above that base flood elevation. And a lot of extra words in there too. But the gist of it is the streets are supposed to be elevated. And that goes back to that flood-free access. Now we're going to get into Division 7. That's where the bulk of our regulations are within Chapter 72. It's our flood hazard management ordinance.
It's 229, and if this is the bulk,
Yep.
Maybe it would be a good moment to take our customary 5-minute break. Try to keep it to 5 if you can. Is that all right? Okay. So come back at no later than 2:39.
Like trying to get that lane but it is, we just gotta.
Yes.
On trails.
There's no open, almond area?
Yes.
There's crossing.
Okay. Well,
It's less paper than you can. To there.
Yeah.
But I'm done with ready. So we're down in lots, it's hard to know. Yes, to me, but you know, we don't do this, so I'm trying to figure out that. But it's more really comprehensive from some of the things that wants to know, we can get flashings and yellow lights during parent drop off and pick up. Naturally.
Engineers makes recommendation, because we don't just go put the multi basement across, we have to do more study to make sure it's warranted. And just like we do with signals and certain other things, stop signs. So I'll talk to him. I'll talk to him.
Would you, and would you let me know?
Sure.
I'll give you my card and you can
Just so she knows I followed it up.
Honestly, that expert in banking, he was having way back then, you appreciate it. Well, but it normally, you're going to get on side of the day, so now. Yeah, I think along canal, Bayless Canal, ENRAC canal, had Florida Street, all that stuff. And had a whole book on how you put on. Yes, you are directed to canal. Mom, that can't be speed. Well, you know what's really been chatting? The problem with that song, right? He just found out, see, it's like.
Yeah.
She's one doing it. That's a lot.
So it's like
That's
that.
no one. So you keep back. It's a direction of, it wasn't like something that. Well, it was pretty like, I mean, I guess, that's a maintenance. I mean, so how do you prove that emergency structure?
That's something right now that I can. Right now, seems really good. They want something legal.
Yeah, I was actually actually not doing it for it. So not doing Install. Yeah, DEPs, they could not.
Just whatever we're in, right? But that would,
And we recently.
Yeah.
I mean, no. New construction.
okay.
Her boss is a kid from cross.
We don't.
It's not that, just I'll talk to you.
Don't be putting this out everywhere. You think this drivers will just start ignoring. Because they're actually going to take. There's some. Based on kind of reading. To cross and one side. So, somebody should or something like that, it may take them 20 seconds cheaper. It's gonna get lost there, so the flashing, you can.
Yeah.
But. Flashing and then. Go, it's crazy.
All the discussions now are.
Yeah.
Well, I mean.
Study.
He said that it would be, if they said, oh, it'll be on. There's no meaning in how much to the building. Oh, no, just let me look.
So.
There's more people.
Would it save your time or not save your time?
Right.
The rest of us try to make the best.
Maybe you want it, they all are.
No, the name of the.
So it's about. My doctors. I don't know anything about that.
Stay.
About that.
Watch the class. I forget because.
Wow.
Just kind of look through all the stuff, make sure it's not. Then that 2 days version I just need here, I probably can introduce her to church. Yeah, that's how she gets it.
Everybody made it back with 1 minute to spare. So, we are reconvening. Samantha, please continue.
All right. So Division 7, flood hazard management. I wanted to underline this specific portion that's at the very beginning of the division because all of these items that are added within this ordinance are based off that scientific and engineering considerations. And that it does not imply that land outside the mapped special flood hazard areas or uses within those hazard areas will be free from flooding or flood damage, right? We're trying to make it better. We're trying to reduce the risk. It does not mean it won't have any risk. Okay, so I want y'all to keep that in mind as we're going through it. Okay, so this division applies to all of the flood hazard areas in unincorporated Volusia County. There is a floodplain administrator that is assigned officially to land development manager. Right now, it is at our chief building official. I was going to say you, but it's not you. So it's over in our building department right now. And these are the roles that are on the screen that floodplain administrator has to do. A lot of it is looking at those impacts to the flood hazard areas. So whether that be through a development project, a building permit, what have you, any of those types of impacts they have to look at. So Kelly has a lot of work. So, you know, it's all delegated to her. Right. This is something that sometimes people get really confused on, is that you may need a flood hazard management permit, even if you don't need a building permit. So areas that are typically exempt from the Florida Building Code may still need a flood hazard management permit per our code. So that includes those non-residential farm buildings on farms. So if you're an agricultural operation and you're putting a building, or if you want to dig a ditch on your property in the floodplain, you have to come in for a permit with our office. Also temporary building sheds, any modular mobile structures, all of the things that are listed here.
Do we actually have any chickies in Volusia County?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yes,
Do
yes. Where 2 people have had the Seminole Indians come and construct them. They're exempt from the building code.
But they are not exempt from the floodplain management ordinance. So if they are going to build said chickie within the flood hazard areas, then they would need to comply with our ordinance. Any questions on this? Because this is a main source of confusion for our citizens in the county.
And it's becoming more and more of a hot topic as well, out of nowhere. I'm not sure why, but.
So let me ask you on that, and it's not about the ag buildings, but all of these buildings, how many people apply for these permits? I mean, because you're building in a floodplain.
I do not have a list or a number. Do you have a number or an idea?
You're hitting it right on the head. It's because most of the folks who are involved in active agriculture, those who have bona fide agricultural classifications, know they're exempt from the Florida Building Code and the local zoning regulations. So they proceed on and they put in their pole barns, their metal buildings and those types of things as they would anyway. So it's really a complaint driven situation.
And I'm not worried about the ag buildings in this question. It's how many people come and build a structure of that nature in a floodplain? I mean, is this a very common thing or is it?
I would say, well, we did have one code enforcement case where it did occur, where we had, there was someone who came in for an ag structure and expanded it beyond the ag use. And when we went back to investigate, they did not meet the finished floor elevation. But because the original ag building was open walled, in other words, it was a pole barn.
Sure.
It met the requirements for a free flow through it. So it did not have to have anything, right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of them, I know that you're not concerned about the farm buildings and things of that sort, but I think that's where a lot of them
it
are.
occurs from.
And,
I
so,
can't vouch for my fellow agriculture guys that want to build in a floodplain.
well, because if you don't have to have a building permit or comply with zoning regulations, you do it, right?
Right.
So that might be something that we have to focus outreach efforts on to make sure that people are aware that this is required and these are the regulations in our code.
Well, I know we just had conversations with Matt Roth over at Magnolia Farms. He's putting in a metal building. So the word is getting out in the agricultural world because they've heard it and he contacted us to verify what was required to put in his metal building. So that was a good sign.
Yeah.
So as I kind of touched on a little bit ago, this is also for any development within the flood hazard areas. Development includes any dredging, filling, grading, paving, or excavations. So that's another one that trips citizens up a lot because maybe they have an agricultural operation and they are ditching the property for who knows what, whatever for their agricultural operation, and it's going through a floodplain. So in that instance, they would have to come in for a permit for compliance. I've run into them a few times as a complaint-driven situation. And as we already talked about, the ones that are exempt from the Florida Building Code also need a permit. Any questions on that? Now we're going to get into kind of specifics. So subdivisions, they must all show the flood hazard area on the plans. It is a requirement, and if it's over 50 lots or larger than 5 acres, they have to determine the base flood elevation. So as Kelly was talking about, if it is within that flood hazard area, that zone A, where that base flood elevation is not determined, if it trips this threshold, then they have to, even if there is no development within that flood hazard area on the property. So you have 5-acre property, they are going to cluster their lots over here in the corner. They are supposed to still do a study and determine that base flood elevation. That's the way we can update our maps, right? For site improvements, there are requirements that if you're close to a floodway, as we were talking about earlier, for distance of how you are or are not allowed to have any type of encroachments, that's within the first bullet point there. You can't have any development or that excavating, disturbing activity within that regulatory floodway. And for their specific requirements for coastal high hazard areas as well for the disturbance of mangroves or sand dunes. So we do get more specific within our regulations for certain site improvements, and lots of them have to do with grading, right? So that's where we run into a lot of things because they're changing the topography of that area or that site. And as Kelly said, that regulatory floodway is very important. It has more stringent standards within all the tiers we talked about today.
John and Jack.
In terms of, in that coastal, I was in the coastal construction zone. My fill had to be beach compatible sand. And if
And the only place I can get it is in the sand pit over in Oak Hill. But I mean, I think it's like, so that, I got it.
Jack?
I was wondering how this applies to docks, because you're talking about encroachment to a stream. So how does that fit? Is it applied the same way because you're talking to, equal to 5 times the width of the stream? So how do you put a dock in on your property?
I mean, we don't have, nor does the building code have a specific requirement for docks. Docks are allowed to get wet, docks are open, they can, they're not obstructing a flow like a structure
So
would.
you're not considering them encroachment?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're not bringing in fill either, right? Or doing any grading activities within that if it's in a regulatory floodway
Well, you
for
might.
a dock.
I mean-
But for the majority, well, that's why there is a plan review that.
We do have a plan review to make sure you're not doing that. And typically, I have not ran across one, last couple of years that's doing anything like that. It's just, cut and dry, running the dock straight out, no fill. They're not altering anything with the banks or anything like
Right,
that.
seawall, same thing.
Yeah.
But you could backfill into the seawall and all that.
That was the question.
Yeah, for seawalls, they would need, there would be a more intense review if they're gonna be backfilling within that.
Yeah, if it's gonna go.
And alter the floodway, then
Right.
it's gonna require a review.
Yes.
I see that a lot in my neighborhood.
And it depends if it's in a regulatory floodway or not, and we only have certain areas in the county that are designated by that. So we have specific requirements for manufactured homes. They cannot be within the floodways or the coastal high hazard areas unless they're already existing. They have to be anchored. You're gonna see that within the next few slides. Everything has to be anchored so it doesn't float away. And also you don't want any collapsing or lateral movement, same thing, you don't want to float away. And the foundations and frame elevations is all in Kelly's wheelhouse on those requirements. And making sure that complies with the Florida Building Code. Specifics on the RVs and park trailers. Can't have it in that zone B, that's that coastal high hazard area, once again, unless it's already existing. And you can't put any new sites within those areas. So if it is gonna be within that flood hazard area, there are standards for how long it can be there. We have in the code that it's less than 180 consecutive days, and we have to make sure that it's ready to move. So if there is an issue, you're not keeping it there forever, right? We don't need something on blocks that it can't get out of that flood hazard area. Tanks are a big thing. I think that every floodplain management presentation I've ever been at, there's always a picture of a tank on fire floating down the river, after there's a flood. So that's why we have very specific requirements for tanks. So they have to be, if they are above ground, then, and not elevated, they are permitted except in that zone B. That zone B has to do with that velocity. So you have that storm surge, you have those issues happening there. So you definitely don't want them there to float away. And then if they are above ground and elevated, then it has to be above that base flood elevation, like Kelly was talking about. A lot of those generators are done with, just lost the word, but tanks that power them.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Propane tanks.
thank you. And we don't want those propane tanks, with the ones that catch on fire and float down the river, right?
Just look.
And that's part of plan review too, on the propane tanks, is we make sure we get anchoring details from them as well.
And then there's requirements for inlets and vents on those structures. We have additional regulations on those coastal high hazard areas. I did not put in all of the specific requirements because there are a lot for each of them, but we have it for the concrete slabs, the decks and patios, the seawalls, bulkheads, if there's solid fences or privacy walls, think about that. That's going to be blocking, you have the velocity of the flow happening with that storm surge. So there are specific requirements for if you can or can't, or where you can or can't have those solid fences and privacy walls out there. And then for the on-site treatment and disposal system. And we've hit everything within Division 7. Which is the bulk of our flood hazard management regulations, without giving you line by line, word by word. Questions? It was a lot.
Jessica.
When you have individuals come in like for floodplain mitigation for raising the equipment specifically above a certain area or in coastal high hazard, do you have typical sections or materials you can give the applicant to say like an AC contractor who has to raise the AC up on an older structure so the structure's not coming up, just the piece of it is, like how that installation should work?
We reference them in the codes. I mean, our license does not allow us to give them
Design input, right?
design or ideas of how it should work. But it's got to meet compliance of that particular section of building code. We did have actually that come up with an electrical system because in coastal high hazard area breakaway walls, you can't mount like the electrical service on the wall. So he wanted to do this platform, which is absolutely allowed. And it checked out with that part of the code that, the height requirement and, right down to the size post they were putting in.
Does anyone else have any other questions? This is the second month in a row. Jessica?
It's fascinating. I know in the code, there's a provision that allows certain modifications to improvements within the floodplain for like substantial improvement and substantial damage. Is that utilized? I would think rarely. I know there's discretion in there, but it seems discretionary.
Right. When it comes to substantial damage assessment, and I've had my fair share of it the last 2 years, I rarely see any kind of modifications used that's acceptable. These structures in the flood zone, you can't even put paint on them without having to be accounted for. I mean, technically, according to FEMA and NFIP, you paint your house, you got to come in for a floodplain permit. It doesn't cost you, we're not charging, it doesn't cost you, but it gets something in, we have it on document, because believe it or not, FDEM and FEMA do tours of our county. And those cab tours, they randomly drive around and they mark things down, and you don't even know it's taking place, all of a sudden you get an email, we've identified 27 properties and we want the answers to this. And it can be, they saw a propane tank, they see what looks like an addition, and they know it's in the flood zone, and we have to produce evidence that we asked for this and that it's compliant. And all those good things. So with substantial damage, it's as crazy as it sounds. You can change out doorknobs inside the house. You're supposed to have a floodplain permit. But I mean, we know people are doing that. Yeah, it's pretty intense.
I just gotta elaborate on this, is that obviously we started back with Charlie Francis and Gene and all the way through all the hurricanes we've experienced. We're seeing greater scrutiny by FEMA for our post-disaster assessment. Those of you familiar with what happened down in Lee County and also with Cape Coral, they basically kicked them out of the program because they felt that they weren't doing sufficient analysis for substantial damage and those types of things. That is something we definitely do not want to have occur here in Volusia County. So we've been working with our partners at FEMA to make sure that we are in compliance. We are following all of their guidance, and more importantly, we're utilizing their substantial damage estimator when we talk with these folks who have flooded. I can tell you it's my personal frustration is reflected from what I see all the fine people I work with. You're dealing with a couple who are out there looking at their home with water up to the, the rafters, and you're like, yeah, that's 51% damage. You can't rebuild your house as it was. You're going to have to come in. It's not necessarily the greatest message to deliver to someone after they've seen their entire, basically home destroyed. So we're trying to work within those confines as best we can. I can tell you this much, FEMA is auditing us on a regular basis after these storms and after the emergency events that have occurred. And so we are taking it very seriously. The 51% standard is in concrete, and we have, I can tell you, very little ability to squeeze out things. We do see folks that are trying to avoid it. You'll have a contractor saying, well, the material's being donated. Too bad. We have to get the value of that factored into it. And it's over a 5-year period rolling. So that means when the event occurs and you come in, Kelly and her staff are over there looking over the last 5 years of your property. And even if the prior owner spent money on it, it still counts towards what you're doing. And we do have a coastal property where the owner bought the home, renovated it, spent a considerable amount of money on it, and then 2 years later, it was damaged. And that 200K that he spent on it initially counted towards that 50% valuation. And so he had to demo the home and the new home had to be elevated. So it is a very serious situation. We are following through with it, but it's going to be interesting over the next several years how FEMA follows through with that.
Not to mention how little most people know about this.
Hello. That 51% rule, we talk about applying to substantial damage. It's also applies to new construction. If we've run into that with granny flats. People want to add granny flats to their homes, bring mom in and raise the home value up to the point that they get. Now, there are workarounds around that, and I've seen these where unscrupulous builders say, well, I'm going to add this piece to your house over here. It'll raise the value of your home. So then the 51% threshold, when you come in for granny, won't be met. They're sneaky, these guys are. But it's not just,
Substantial improvement.
right, it's just not, but it's not just for damage. It can also be for.
It's substantial improvement slash damages stuff. So those two work hand in hand. Sometimes it's just an improvement you're doing. Sometimes it's damage and you're having to improve it. So the term works both ways, but you are correct with additions, lateral additions. There's a whole thing you gotta look at with additions for sure.
Oh, Bill,
So what's our task?
that was funny you should ask. Did you have another question, Tom? Okay. It seems we've concluded our business for today. So, and Jessica, do you have something right now additional? Sorry. Okay. So next month's meeting would be to hear from you about recommended changes to our floodplain management.
Yeah, we can come back with recommended changes, and I identify those for you and maybe spark discussion, about if what we recommended is sufficient or, have anything additional to add or remove.
Does that sound good for everyone?
Okay, one part of that conversation will be from the Florida Department of Emergency Management. They have a model local ordinance for flood zone management. So we will include that because it is kind of the litmus test that DEM utilizes when they're analyzing whether or not a local government is doing the best they can to comply with their requirements. So it's not a specified mandate, but it's a very strongly implied mandate.
Bill?
Does the current code reflect kind of that model code? Or
Yes.
do they completely rewrite?
No, we're up to date. There's debates on the definitions where you have your definitions that create some interesting conversations between the county bureaucrats and the state bureaucrats.
And jumping on definitions, the Division 7 flood hazard management has specific definitions within it, specific to that division, right? It's not in the overall portion of Chapter 72. So we have things that are specific to the requirements of Division 7.
Is there anything you want us? Is there anything that you recommend we read and study that is in our possession now prior to our next meeting to make it fruitful?
I would definitely, if you haven't already, just glance at the policies and goals that we have in our comp plan that I highlighted for you, just so that you have a general understanding of what is already in there and like what our goals are for the county, right? And you also have the Division 4 and Division 7 is on the website as well. So if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of what we talked about today, you can do that and then start writing your own notes for recommendations. But I would think about a holistic view of the county, and because this is applied to every property within the flood hazard area. So just keep that in mind when you're coming up with ideas.
Jessica?
A question on homework. Does the county have any mapping available or numbers that could be shared that identify how many structures we know exist in the floodplain that don't meet these regulations are grandfathered in, if you will?
I am not aware of ones that are not, that are grandfathered and that don't meet the regulations. We do have numbers identifying how many structures within the flood hazard area. Those numbers have been updated. They're doing our local mitigation strategy update right now. The emergency management division is doing that, so they have gathered numbers for that and our overall floodplain management plan as well. So I can get that for you, but the difference between what's in compliance and what's not.
Sure. Okay.
Also, right now, did FEMA adopt that upper Northwest St. John's update to the flood insurance?
Not aware. I will look into that.
For personal notification, the FEMA has a website called FEMA Map Store, the FEMA Map Service Center. And it's just for the fun of it. You can type in your own street address and it'll bring you to that flood zone map. And then you get a look at what they look like for your house and the surrounding area. It's very enlightening.
It's a very easy to use mapping service as well. So I definitely recommend that. Thanks.
If you have a link, could you possibly send that?
I can definitely send it to you.
One thing from a staff perspective, just to give you all a little anecdotal information. Our prior community rating service system manager, Constance Bentley, lives in an area of South Daytona. She's out of the flood zone, but her property is flooded twice because of the hurricanes that occurred because she's tied to a coastal drainage system. So the fact is that the floodplain management standards are effective for those areas that are in a floodplain that suffer a 100-year flood event, storm event. That's 11 inches. When you start getting into 18, 22, 28 inches of rain over a 24-hour period, all bets are off. Because at that point, there's no stormwater system that's been designed that can accommodate that. And also the fact is that areas that have not previously flooded will flood.
Are you guys working on a floodplain study or something also?
We're doing, Ben behind me can tell you how many basin studies he's trying to get out in the next 5 minutes.
Right now, there are 30 basin studies funded throughout the county through Transform 386. 4 of those are county initiated ones. The remaining 26 are city ones. The county ones are looking at Spruce Creek, Little Hall Creek, DeLand Ridge, and off the top of my head, Deep Creek is the other one. So those are large. Those are 4 of the large, 16 large watershed basins that we have identified in the county. The cities are doing any number of, from a master stormwater plan of the entire city to localized sub-basins where they experience flooding during the storms. And the focus on these watershed studies is identifying the areas that flooded and then coming up with solutions. Engineering solutions or potential land acquisition to hopefully mitigate for future flooding.
And will all these come out just separately? We have to watch the cities for those reports?
No, actually, because they're all funded through Transform 386, sub-recipient agreements, all that money, we are the direct recipient of the money from the federal government. It's difficult to do sub-recipient agreements because of the federal entanglements associated with using federal money. So all of those studies are actually being procured and administered by the county. And so not this meeting 2 days ago, yesterday. Yeah, it all runs together. Sorry. On the consent item, there were three studies. One was Spruce Creek with the county. There were 2 Ormond studies. There's there were some smaller Orman studies that you didn't see, which were actually under the manager's threshold. So those have already been initiated. But on the previous meeting, there was a task assignment to one of our consultants that are going to do a large scale, it's like a program management where they're going to specify what these studies, what the deliverables are going to be, what they're going to utilize the same. We're going to basically be able to hand a set of technical specifications to each consultant that does one of these studies. We're not giving all 30 to one consultant, but we're going to hand them basically a list of specifications on how these studies are going to look so that they all kind of will interact with each other. And the goal is to set up sort of a central repository of all of these studies, so that, because they're utilized by consultants and the public alike, where folks can go and look at them if they have questions.
Just one comment as someone who watches an awful lot of council meetings. And we know how upset people are, and we have told them that part of our stormwater work and part of our analysis of what's going on in the county to help them get out of the flooding problems that they're in are basin studies. And I actually made a phone call to someone who will remain nameless, but to ask if those 3 agenda items yesterday were the basin studies, because it seemed like they were, but they had a different name. And I'm just telling you from a PR standpoint.
Yes.
Get around that.
Yeah, well, part of it is we've set up, we just went live with a flooding and stormwater website at the county. I've been told that we have to see Public Works. We've always viewed ourselves as like the umpire or the referee. If you know our name, it means we probably screwed up. So to get out of that mindset, I've been told that we've got to get better at PR and talk about what we do and how we do it and all the good things that we do. A big part of that was canal maintenance, which was touched on yesterday. And there was a perception that wasn't being done, and it is being done, and it's being done well, and it's a fight that we're fighting. But so we have gone live with this website that will basically be kind of the front page for a lot of the, there's some news and things like that. In fact, the Taylor Road study that was ongoing just got published there yesterday. So, we're working on getting the word out on those kinds of things. One thing we're going to start doing is, and part of our capital projects update is updating all the flood studies and projects that are going on. And then we're also going to be pushing people to that website using all of the social media and all that fun stuff to try to make people understand of all the things that we got going on. Now, to your point, I've tried to say this: flood projects, basin, watershed analysis, all those kinds of things take time. Because I've had people say, well, wait a minute, hurricane season's coming, you haven't done anything. Well, I've had projects from, the 2009 rain event that didn't get finished until 2016, so that's how long these things take to go from, identifying the potential solution to design, permitting, land acquisition, all those kinds of things to get done. Some can get done faster, some will take longer depending on the size. So, we're working as fast as we can. And in addition to those 30 studies, there's 18 projects that are funded through Transform 386 when we're going out for round 2 to the cities that didn't receive funding the first time. So there's a lot of, like anything, there's a lot of stuff in the works, but once it starts rolling, it'll be a continuous process.
Anything else?
Just in terms of the next meeting, which is May 7th, right? We talked at some point about if we're going to have comments that we want as part of the backup, that staff would need them at least a week before. Is that still true? I want to give people deadlines. So the week before that would be April 30th for any comments that we want as part of the backup on the draft changes.
Yes, so any comments that you want to send out to the whole group as a part of our email that we normally do, make sure you get that to us the week before, because we send out your packets the week before, right? So I have to have them before then.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, give us enough time then to review to meet an April 30 deadline. Okay, with that, we are adjourned. Today.
All right.